Welcome to a new tutorial. In today's video we're going to create this in Blender. This time our default cube is lucky. We're not going to delete it, but we're going to keep it in our scene. So just move it a bit up and rotate it along the viewing axis and along the Z-axis as well, to give this kind of isometric look. This will be later on shattered and we're going to look at that in more detail. So next up, we're going to create a new landscape, and we're going to do that by using the ANT landscape add-on. Make sure to enable that. Then just choose a random seed, but leave everything on default. And depending on the performance of your computer, you might want to bump up the resolution in both X and Y a bit. I'm going to choose 400 for this one, and then I'm going to scale everything up. So we've got the right proportions. This will be our main mountainscape. And now let's frame our scene a bit, add in a camera and choose a very long focal length, because the longer the focal length, the more you've got the impression that you're actually very far away, and zoom in, and that looks a bit more real. Let's make the aspect ratio kind of this vertical mode and set our render engine to cycles, of course enable GPU compute. For the first preview, I'm gonna add in a quick point light that I'm gonna place behind our foreground mountain, and that we're gonna use to illuminate our scene. So now let's speed that up a bit and have a look at how we place things in the scene. We're gonna use another landscape, or you can simply choose the one you've got right there and duplicate it all around your scene to create kind of this effect. Very important here is we want to create depth and we want to create some layers. So go and layer all of these mountains along the Y-axis and don't just place them in one layer, but move them a bit on the axis. Later on, we're going to add some volumetrics, and this will make that look a bit more distant. But for now, I think I really like the composition. So next up, we're going to have a look at our default cube. This time we're going to destroy it, and we're going to use the self-fracture add-on. So make sure to enable that in the add-ons. Then choose your annotation tool, and with your annotation tool selected, go into the settings, and for the placement, select surface. And if you draw on your cube, actually the strokes will align to the surface of our cube. So paint some strokes in like this. Just use this top part of the cube. Then hit F3, search for self-fracture, use our annotations as our source, then increase the source limit by a bit, maybe add some noise and add one recursion. And this will now automatically crack our cube and mainly do that, give it a lot more detail on the parts that we drew on early on. So this is our base. It creates a duplicate of our original cube. Just rename that and then hide it as a backup if you need it in case. But now you can see we've got these individual pieces. And now to create this effect as if a force is sucking out these, all of these pieces, just press O, enable proportional editing, then select one of these shards and drag them along the Z-axis, and you get this pretty cool effect, which you now can manipulate. Select one or two more and then create this illusion. Make sure to not only look at this from the camera view, but from all the other different axes as well, and give this thing a bit of depth and leave this front part intact, and maybe delete these annotations. We don't need them anymore. So under view, delete all of the annotations and then have a look at that in rendered view. And I think this looks pretty okay for the start. We're going to enhance that in a second. And to do so, we're gonna duplicate our main lamp, our point light, and place it right behind all of these shards. The illusion I want to create here is that this cube kind of glows from the inside out. We could do that by using an emission material that we would place right on these inner sections of the shards, but I'm going to use some point lights, which is a very easy technique, and we're going to later on create these Godrays, and this is pretty easy with point lights. So select all of these cubes and move them into their own separate collections. because you don't want to go in back and forth and select all of these cubes. If you want to make some small adjustments, just select the whole collection and then move it like this. Okay, now let's refine that a bit more. And then you can go in and select some of these larger shards. And if you feel like they are a bit too large, just break them again with the self-fracture add-on, add a bit of noise and always add a bit of recursion. I think one step is enough here, because the goal here is to break the uniformity. So what does that mean? That means that you don't want all of your shards to be the same size, the same shape and the same rotation basically. You want to create some variation, and especially in their size. And this recursion option actually adds very small cracks to some of these parts, and that makes it look pretty nice. I'm gonna do that for these parts here as well. Always make sure to enable proportional editing. To get more randomness, you can enable the random setting in the proportional editing, which is a good tip, but I'm just gonna use this default one here. And then make it kind of taper towards the top. And now for our main subject, we're gonna place a 3D cursor in our scene and then append a blend file. And this is actually my Distant Humans pack that you can download in the description below. It is a collection of, I believe it's 6 different planes. So just simple planes with images on them. And it's actually, these human placeholder figures. If I brighten up the scene here a bit, you can see what we've got here. So just a bunch of hikers in different sizes, and they basically auto-orient towards the camera. Just append that to your scene and then copy one that you like to your main scene. And then you can place it right there at your cursor and it will automatically snap it right into place. Of course, make sure to get the correct size. And now he's a bit invisible, and to fix that, we're gonna now open up the shader editor, go into the world settings. So we're gonna change the world up a bit. So select world and then delete the default background shader. We don't need that anymore, and plug in a volumetric principal volume shader right in there and set the density to something low, like 0.2. And the anisotropy should be, about 0.2 or something like that. So it should be very broad and very look like a glowing scene. So now you can see him a bit better, and you can see the landscape a bit better. But I don't like some of these parts here, so I'm just quickly gonna go in the edit mode and use proportional editing to change up some of these shapes right here. So now place him on his feet, make sure he doesn't hover mid-air, and make sure that the size looks good. In this case, I think I want him right on top of this mountain here. Okay, now let's select all of them. As we discussed earlier, you can select all of them. I think I missed a few, or we created a few more shards right here that I didn't put in my main collection. So I'm gonna do that now, put it in the main collection, and always keep your scene tidy. Quick reminder, if you want to download the project files for this tutorial, you can do so in the description below. Go to patreon.com/rescan, and there you'll find all of the projects for my tutorials. Now let's add this torchlight in, because I want him to be kind of this hiker that found this abstract shape here and that uses his torchlight to illuminate the cube. And to do so, I'm just gonna use this spotlight, increase its intensity, and then decrease the radius to something like 0 or 0.001. And this will create this very harsh beam that you can then change up with the spot size and its blend mode, and that you can really narrow down to something like looks good. The moment it's a bit strong, but later on I'm gonna change that up to make it look a bit more real. I hope the audio quality this time is good. I'm actually not recording in my studio today. I am on the road, and I'm just recording with my phone out of the hotel room, so something different today, but I hope it sounds good as well. So what did I do there? I quickly added in a new point light and I gave that a lot of power and made it slightly blue because now I want to introduce some color to the scene. We want to create this sci-fi-like vibe, and this is always blue, bluish green tones. And I'm going to duplicate that one more time and decrease the radius to something very low and increase the brightness and place this light right into my main scene. And now you can see these awesome Godrays. It's pretty easy to create them this way. I really, really love this look. And it's basically just if you've got volumetric shader and a very, very low radius on your point lamp. I'm just going to use one point lamp right here and duplicate this a bunch more times because I feel like that it is actually a bit too dark and you can't really see these top shards right here. But I don't want to keep the radius that low because otherwise we would have too many Godrays and they would interfere too much and that wouldn't look good anymore. So soften them up a bit, place a few of those right inside of these shards, reduce their intensity a bit, and then it looks kind of like it glows. Now let's move that a bit towards the middle part of the scene, and now you can see that the torch light, that this lamp is not that strong anymore and that it looks a bit more real. And again, this is just to add a bit more depth to the scene. Now let's add in an area lamp and make it very, very large. And we want to use that to illuminate this foreground mountain right here, because at the moment it vanished a bit too much in the darkness. And using this area lamp shining right from behind, this creates a pretty beautiful rim light and makes this look pretty nice. I'm doing the same thing to this background mountain right here because it was vanishing a bit too much in the darkness for my taste. So I increased its brightness and changed up a bit of the position. Always placing these lights right behind this stuff to create kind of this rim light, which enhances the texture of our mountain. And yeah, this is what makes stuff like that look cool. Reducing the intensity of that. And yeah, now that is pretty much it for our lighting in the scene, at least for now. And make sure to keep your scene tidy there as well. Now let's look a bit more at the materials. And first off, we're gonna create a material for our abstract cube, and I want to keep it in this abstract theme and create kind of a water surface. So I'm just using a noise texture, very common method. I'm using a noise texture as my base, plugging that into this bump node and plugging that into the bump or the normal input of the principal shader. Then making sure that it is a bit darker and has a lot of specularity, that it is metallic, and that we've got a very low roughness. Then play a bit around with the bump. But you might not see this in effect, and this is because we've got viewport denoising enabled by default, and that a lot of times gets rid of these very small details. Can change that by disabling that or zooming in a bit, and then you'll be able to see that. I think in the final render it will be visible. Make sure that the distortion is not too strong and that the size is readable to the viewer, because if the waves are too small, that doesn't look good as well. So here you can see the before and after with denoising on and denoising turned off. So now I am playing again around with these point lights, and at the moment I feel like the cube is lacking a bit of texture and contrast, and to change that I'm using a few of these point lights to give a reflection of the cube surface. I'm even adding here an area lamp here, but I think I'm gonna change that to a point light. And now you can see I'm adding in a bit of texture to that part. This is an essential part of lighting your scene as well. It is about creating visual interest and not just looking at what looks most real or most believable, but it's more looking at what is interesting and enhancing certain parts of your image. Now I'm just quickly changing up a few things in the background here and there, and then we can take a look at our mountains. Our mountains have a pretty basic material. We want to create the impression of snow. So to do that, we need two materials. The one here I'm creating here is the base material, which is basically a pretty dark material, very rough. And then we're gonna add the snow on top of it in a very procedural way. Pretty cool technique I'm gonna show you now, which is very fast and doesn't require any textures. So to do that, just input a geometry node and use its normal output, and then add in a new separate X, Y, Z node. This separates the vector channels in X, Y, and Z channel. We're going to use the Z channel, plug that into a color ramp, and now you can see it creates this kind of gradient based on the normals, which is pretty helpful for a lot of weather effects, for example, dirt or stuff like that, and grunge. But in this case, we're going to use that for this snow effect, which is pretty efficient and doesn't need a lot of painting or manual work. Yeah, and we're gonna mix that with a mix shader, just create a very white, glossier material and plug both of them into the mix shader and add our newly created snow map basically as the factor input. And then you've got yourself some snow, which is pretty easy and very straightforward. Can use that in a lot of cases. Okay, now I'm gonna make the snow a bit darker because at the moment it was a bit too bright and stood out too much. It just should be a hint. And since we've got a difference between the foreground and background mountains, they are very different in size, I wanna select the foreground mountain in a second and change up some of its snow settings to make it look a bit more real. Playing a bit around with this frontal area lamp to make this effect look a bit more real. Basically, it's always a back and forth between working on shaders and working on lighting because they interact very much with each other. And now I'm doing what I talked about earlier. I'm just playing around with this color ramp, changing the mix factor a bit to make the snow a bit more visible in these parts right here, but giving it a bit more contrast so it just appears on these very top sharp parts of this mountain right there. Speaking of creating depth, let's add another layer of mountains right in there. Just copy the foreground mountain, rotate it a bit and place it right in front of the camera, and this will again add some depth. Later on in post-processing we're gonna add a bit of haze and some very soft fog and glow in, and that will bring everything together. So now let's set everything up for rendering. Let's enable the contrast in the filming settings and then hit F12 to render. So now in Photoshop we're gonna massively enhance our image, and we're gonna do that with my usual method, which is first adding a bit of contrast. So I'm gonna brighten up the whole image by using this layers adjustments or this levels adjustments, and I'm gonna add some color back in with a saturation curve. Now on a next layer, a very empty layer, we're gonna use a very large dark brush and paint in kind of a vignette and make a few parts darker. And this will help to lead the eye of the viewer. Make sure to reduce its opacity because in most cases this is very strong. And not only do that on one layer, but change up your brush hardness a bit and go here to the mountain, for example, or the background mountains. Paint in very selectively and then reduce the opacity to something very low. Add in another layer and again add more vignetting towards the sides. So making broad adjustments, adding color, contrast, saturation, and as you can see, this makes a huge difference, especially the vignetting. This creates a lot of depth and really leads the eye into the scene. So this is our goal in this case. So next up, let's just use a white brush that's actually pretty soft to create some haze. Just place a dot right in there and use the free transform tool to make it kind of this haze shape. Add in a layer mask and then paint over that with a very hard brush, very hard dark brush to remove it wherever you don't want it to appear and then really reduce its opacity. And with that, you pretty easily created yourself some haze without doing any kind of simulation or without using any additional textures. In this case, I'm even creating kind of this illusion of another foreground mountain because you can't see the one we put earlier on. So I create this illusion here by just painting in with a simple brush and then again reducing the opacity of that. And I think I'm gonna add in another one to the right side. Again, create a layer mask and paint in with a very harsh brush. You could have used the selection for the foreground mountain, which is a bit more accurate, but for this tutorial, I'm gonna just use this paint tool. So reduce the opacity, and now we've got some haze in our scene. Let's place another bright part at our main subject, change the blend mode to overlay, and this will add some brightness and color to the center part, again to focus the eye a bit more on the viewer or on the main subject. And I want to focus the eye a bit more on this sci-fi shape here, so I'm going to quickly create this kind of glow effect by using a simple selection and again using the overlay blend mode to add more color and brightness to this part right here. And then I'm going back and forth between these different methods. Creating contrast wherever it's needed. This cube is lacking a bit of micro contrast as well, so it's a bit too gray and is a bit too hazy and foggy, and I want to reduce that by adding a few black parts or a few darker parts that are overlaid on top of this cube, making sure that it only appears where I really want it to appear, and that will add more contrast right here. And I don't like the fact that it is, that you can't really see this cube shape, so it's just like kind of this abstract blob right now. And I'm painting in some of the highlights by myself now, so I'm using again the overlay blend mode on a bit lower opacity, just using a white brush and painting along the edges of our cube, but making sure that I reduce this effect as much as necessary. And if you have a look at that, it really enhances and brings out the shape of our cube. So adding shape, depth, volumetrics, and this is basically what we're going to do here. Again, as adding this haze down there, you see me going back and forth between these different techniques a lot of times. Here I'm looking for this lower part right there. I found it, and then I'm going to reduce that a bit because it was a bit too strong at the moment. So keep all of these effects very subtle. First use the strong version and then really tone that down. Okay, create a new layer and then fill the layer with a 50% gray. And if you've done any sort of retouching before, you know that from pretty much every retouching step in all of the Photoshop tutorials, it is dodging and burning, and you do that on a gray layer. Use a soft light blend mode to blend that on top, and basically that will get rid of the gray parts, and then you can use the dodge or burn tools in Photoshop to make some parts a bit more dark and some a bit brighter. I'm just gonna use the dodge tool right here to make all of these things a bit darker and give my these objects a bit more depth and micro contrast. Always cleaning up, of course. And this is pretty nice. I think it really enhanced the image. And now let's continue and add a subtle glow to our scene. So really crush the blacks, go to filter, Gaussian blur, and then blur the whole scene and overlay this image on top with something like this screen blend mode and a very low opacity, which kind of creates this bloom effect, very subtle, but adds to the realism and gets rid of this digital edge. Now here in this stage, I'm adding some color to the image. You can do that by simply doing some global broad paint adjustments, painting over the scene, changing the color mode or the blend mode to something like soft light, for example, and really introducing some color to the scene, because at the moment it was just a bit blue and gray, and now we can change that with this simple technique. Very nice technique to add more contrast and color to the scene is to use the color lookup tables. So now you see me just quickly scrolling through all of these presets, and this will get your scene in a good direction. And you can change stuff like the blend mode, for example, and the opacity. Blend mode, for example, like color, works pretty good if you don't want the contrast of a certain look, but you just want to keep the colors, and vice versa. Now I'm on a new layer. I'm using the high pass filter on a very, very large setting to kind of add more micro contrast. And I'm gonna use the custom layer mask to paint that into all of the parts where I want it to appear, which is mainly our main subject and this sci-fi box up there. And then I'm gonna use another high pass layer with the soft light blend mode to sharpen the whole image a bit more and to pull everything together. Now, finally, one of the last adjustments I do is I go into the camera raw tab and again make some broad global adjustments, like for example, the color temperature, brightness, contrast. Main thing here I want to point out is try to reduce the clarity a bit. This adds, again, this kind of glowy, dreamy look, and this gets rid of the digital edge, and do some color grading and give the dark parts a bit more bluish color, give the highlights a bit more greenish color in this case, to get this sci-fi look going. And this is a very small enhancement, but it does its job. Yeah, I think now we're almost done. I'm just quickly gonna add a final vignette on top of my image, and I think that concludes this image. I think it looks pretty good. And I think it was 1 hour in real time, I think you can do a lot of stuff. And yeah, final thing I'm gonna add some monochromatic noise on a very low setting to give this kind of vintage look, or to bring again everything together. It's adding these camera defects basically to make everything look a bit more real. Hi, I'm Kevin, I'm a 3D artist, and I've been using Blender professionally for over 10 years now. As a Blender artist, I always was very intimidated by these large landscape scenes. I mean, they look awesome, but I always thought they were way too complex to handle. And if you can relate, I gotcha. I created a Blender course that teaches you basically that. In 4 chapters, you'll learn the ins and outs of working with large landscape scenes in Blender. We'll be creating an awesome medieval fantasy landscape without any expensive add-ons right there in Blender. We quickly build a modular castle, look at procedural rocks, mountains, vegetation and haze that are optimized for render speed. This course is perfect for everyone who knows his basic way around Blender. Basically, I will teach you everything from concept to post-processing. After you've completed this course, you'll not only have a very strong portfolio piece, but you will be able to create a large-scale fantasy scene like this one with ease. So, to learn more, follow this link. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to this channel to stay always up to date with new tutorial releases. And if you want access to the project files, check out patreon.com/rescan to learn more.